Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. My name is Mohammed Saleh. War has resumed in the Gaza Strip, and what this means is that the possibility of this war spilling beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza is very real. At this moment, a humanitarian catastrophe is sweeping through the Gaza Strip. More than 15,000 Palestinians have been killed, and over 70% of all casualties in the Gaza Strip are those of innocent women and children. But what is giving sleepless nights to a lot of geopolitical experts around the world is the very real possibility that the Houthis in Yemen could potentially shut down the Bab-el-Mandeb choke point in the Red Sea to bring pressure on the Americans to rein in the Israeli onslaught. Our next report gets you more details. On the 19th of November, the world woke up to a hijack on the high seas. Armed men in fatigues rappelled down a helicopter and took over the crew of a cargo ship and altered its course towards the port city of Hodeidah. What has since become abundantly clear is that the Red Sea corridor is no longer a safe place of transit for ships owned by Israel or its allies. The 189-metre-long cargo ship called Galaxy Leader was operated by a Japanese crew and was carrying a Bahamas flag. Initially, Israel even tried to distance itself from the ship, but it soon emerged that the ship was linked to the Israeli billionaire Abraham Rami Ungar.
The Yemeni armed forces reiterate their warning to all ships affiliated with the Israeli enemy or those dealing with it that they will become legitimate targets for the armed forces and urge all countries whose nationals operate in the Red Sea to refrain from any work or activity with Israeli ships or ships owned by Israelis.
With the uneasy truce in Gaza having snapped, Israel has resumed its crippling bombardment of the Palestinian enclave. And what this means is that the Red Sea corridor, one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, going out of service for Israel is a very real possibility. The Houthi involvement in the Gaza war won't happen in the Gaza Strip. The strategic location of Yemen on the Bab-el-Mandeb choke point means that the biggest escalation of the Gaza war outside the Palestinian territories will happen at the Bab-el-Mandeb. The Bab-el-Mandeb, which means the Gate of Grief, is a choke point that is just 20 kilometers wide between the Yemeni island of Mayoun to the coast of Djibouti and Eritrea. An estimated 18,000 ships pass through this stretch every single year, which means an average of 50 ships pass through these waters every single day. That is approximately 12% of the global trade must make its way through this narrow checkpoint, which the Houthis can disrupt in case of an escalation. Business analysts have already sounded an alarm at the global supply chains getting disrupted. According to Standard & Poor's Commodity Insights, the incident has already exposed Israeli tankers to high insurance rates. In the worst-case scenario, the disruption of this critical trade route can bring the United States and Iran into a direct confrontation. On the 9th of November, the Houthis published a video of shooting down the deadly MQ-9 Reaper drone along the Yemeni coast. The longer Israel's war in the Gaza Strip progresses, the more real becomes the possibilities of the Houthis trying to shut down the Bab-el-Mandeb, potentially plunging the world supply chain into a tailspin. The war in Gaza has drowned out the bruising war in Ukraine from the public's imagination. But the fact is, Moscow's invasion of Ukraine is now in its 21st month. The battle lines are frozen. The Western support for Ukraine after the failed spring counter-offensive has created a sense of war fatigue. But there is a quiet realization that even with the best Western weapons, Kyiv has been unable to push back the Russian troops. And now with the onset of winter, the Russians, it appears, are gearing up for their own winter offensive. Heliopol is one of the last frontline villages in Zaporizhia that is still under the control of the Ukrainians. Only those people who are too poor and who have nowhere else to go are the only ones who are still living here. Water is scarce, electricity is gone, and keeping oneself warm in the winter is a real struggle.
The missile hit and the walnut tree was smashed to pieces. The window was smashed too. The car was destroyed. I have chopped and dried the bits of wood and can use them now for burjuika stove.
In Novorovdivka, in the eastern part of Donetsk, 2 people were killed and at least 10 others were injured in a Russian missile strike. Ukrainian positions in Robotyne are being hammered by the Russian artillery, while cruise missiles launched from the Russian frigates in the Black Sea have been used to destroy Ukraine's military and energy infrastructure. What is unfolding at this moment is a build-up to a Russian winter offensive, for which Kyiv is increasingly looking ill-prepared and ill-equipped.
The Russian group of forces are carrying out effective and powerful strikes against the Ukrainian army. As a result of this, their capabilities have been drastically decreased. Our servicemen act skillfully and decisively. They are taking better positions and are expanding their control in all directions.
The biggest backer of the Ukrainian war effort, the United States, is making all the right noises, but is not committing the necessary weapons where its mouth is.
Russia sought to destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and to deprive the Ukrainian people of access to heat and electricity at the coldest time of the year. Russia tried to break the will of the Ukrainian people, but of course it failed. As we head into yet another winter, we expect that Russia will return to this cruel tactic and again try to pursue a campaign to destroy Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure.
Publicly, NATO leaders have insisted that there is no other option than to back Ukraine. But reports have emerged in the German media of a potential secret plan for Ukraine, where the American President Joe Biden and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz want to nudge Kyiv to negotiate with the Kremlin. Faced with this waning support for its war, the big question is, how much longer can Ukraine hold out against the slowly tightening Russian onslaught? On the 2nd of November, the Russian President Vladimir Putin revoked Russia's ratification of the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is a global treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. The move sent alarm bells ringing. In an attempt to allay the fears, Moscow said that the revocation would not lead to a resumption of nuclear testing again. But it's also added a caveat. The United States too must refrain from nuclear testing. For the record, present-day Russia and erstwhile USSR had tested its last nuclear weapon on the 24th of October in 1990, while the United States' last nuclear test had been on the 23rd of September in 1992. In the backdrop of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, the revocation has led to increasingly hostile rhetoric and also the arms control architecture that was built since Soviet Union's collapse more than 3 decades ago has now begun to unravel. How credible is the risk of a full-blown nuclear war, especially when viewed in the light of the deteriorating Russia-US relations? Perhaps it would be wise to listen to the voices of the people affected by these nuclear tests and learn from them.
About 450 nuclear tests were conducted between 1949 and 1989 on the barren steppe near the city of Semey, close to the Kazakh-Russian border. More than 100 of these tests were atmospheric, and the rest, post-1963, were conducted underground. The above-ground explosions, known as atmospheric tests, were in practice until 1963. Authorities used to order local people out of their homes and schools for any such detonations above ground, fearing that ground tremors might cause buildings to collapse.
I must have been a 5-year-old boy. I was very young. We have been told training was supposed to take place. At a certain point of time, leave the house and do not look towards Leone mountain. But we were young and curious, so we looked in that direction. First came a yellow flash and a black mushroom after it. The adults tried to drive us away.
The effect of radiation exposure was devastating on the environment and on the health of unsuspecting local people. Kazakh authorities estimate up to 1.5 million people were exposed to residual radioactive fallout from testing. What was their compensation? A certificate confirming their status as victims of tests, which made them eligible for an equivalent of a $40 monthly payout. Over 1 million people received such certifications. Some lost most of their family members to related diseases.
My father died when he was 58. Then my elder brother died, and my sister too. All of them died. We were children and knew nothing. Nobody dared to oppose the government then.
Though there is little reliable data available on the specific health impact of testing in Kazakhstan, scientists believe exposure to radioactive material on the ground, inhalation of radioactive particles in the air, and ingestion of contaminated food, including local livestock, did contribute to increased cancer risk and cases of congenital malformation. The damage wasn't just limited to regions exposed to direct radiation. Steppe winds carried the nuclear fallout across an area the size of Italy. A large portion of such territory is still considered too contaminated to inhabit or cultivate. At a time of rising risk of nuclear war, lending an ear to the sagacious voices would be a wise decision.
We are the people who have witnessed the consequences of the nuclear test site activity. If the countries resume nuclear tests, this is going to repeat itself. The population of the world would be killed. Let our sufferings teach others a lesson. It is necessary to convey our distress to other people. If this resumes, the humankind will disappear.
A 1963 treaty banned the nuclear weapons test in the atmosphere, in space or underwater. But the underground testing, too, poses serious environmental and health risks, besides the potential for contamination of groundwater. Most dangerous of all is the fact that the radioactive contamination lasts for generations. A momentary mistake could potentially impair generations to come. It's time the world paid attention.
In Myanmar, the ruling military junta is facing its biggest challenge since having seized power in a 2021 coup. An alliance of 3 Myanmar ethnic minority groups, called the Brotherhood Alliance, has waged coordinated offensive since the 27th of October. The offensive, named by the rebels as Operation 1027, signifying the date on which it began, has made some inroads into the junta-controlled areas in the northern Shan state, the Kyiv state, and also in the Rakhine state in the west. Over 100 military outposts have been overrun. Trade routes to neighboring China have been cut off, and more than 330,000 people have been displaced since the offensive was launched. The Myanmar army so far has failed to mount a serious counter-offensive on the ground and is primarily relying on air and artillery strikes. Almost 200 civilians, including children, have been killed in these clashes. So what's happening in Myanmar at this moment? Our next report gets you the details.
Pauktaw is a principal town of Sitwe district in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, situated 25 kilometers from the state's capital. Pauktaw has become one of the key battlegrounds, with heavy battles being reported from in and around the town. Opening a new front in the offensive, one of Myanmar's ethnic minority groups, the Arakan Army, moved into Pauktaw on the 15th of November. to regain control of the key town with a population of 20,000. The Myanmar military has carried out a sustained offensive involving fighter jets. For the past 2 weeks, military has been shelling Paukta from bases around Sittwe. According to the United Nations, 18,000 residents of the Paukta town have already fled. The Arakan army is one of a dozen armed ethnic minority groups, battling Myanmar's military since independence from Britain in 1948. Last month, it joined forces with the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army and the Ta'ang National Liberation Army in an offensive against the junta across northern Shan state bordering China. Increasingly wary of conflicts in northern Myanmar spilling over the shared border, Beijing sent warships of the 44th Fleet to Yangon on the 27th of November, calling it a normal military exchange between the two sides.
This is a normal military exchange between China and Myanmar. Regarding China's position on the conflict in northern Myanmar, we have made clear repeatedly that we are closely following the conflicts in northern Myanmar. And we urge the relevant parties in Myanmar to cease fire as soon as possible, peacefully resolve their differences through dialogue and consultation, avoid escalation of the situation, and take practical and effective measures to ensure security and stability along the China-Myanmar border.
The China-Myanmar border is fraught with drug trafficking and people smuggling, a source of constant irritation for Beijing. China's People's Liberation Army conducted military exercises along its border with Myanmar on the 25th of November. The stated aim of the drills is to test the ability of troops to control and close borders and to strike with firepower should any emergencies arise. Reportedly, Myanmar's ruling junta were apprised about the military exercises. Beijing also urged its citizens to leave northern Myanmar as soon as possible and to stay away from the fighting. Earlier, Beijing had pledged to help resettle people who had crossed its border fleeing clashes in northern Myanmar.
Since the outbreak of fighting in northern Myanmar, some people from the Myanmar side have entered the Chinese side to escape the fighting. Out of humanitarianism and close friendship, the Chinese side has properly resettled the people from the Myanmar side who entered China to avoid the war and made every effort to treat the sick and injured.
Though unrest in Myanmar's border region has been a constant irritant, Beijing nevertheless backed the military junta who grabbed power in February 2021 from an elected government. How long will Beijing stand in Myanmar junta's corner? And what possible implications it might have on the groundswell of opposition backed by armed resistance? Only time will tell if the coordinated offensive proves to be a turning point in the history of Myanmar.
At least 19 people were killed and nearly 2,000 inmates escaped in Sierra Leone, where the country's main military barracks and prisons were attacked on the 19th of November. The Sierra Leone government has characterized the Sunday's assault as a failed coup attempt, which aimed to subvert and overthrow the government. Several countries in West and Central Africa are presently under military rule after a series of recent coups, including Sierra Leone's neighbor Guinea, as well as Mali, Niger and Chad. In Sierra Leone itself, the political situation has been pretty tense since June this year, after President Julius Maada Bio's re-election in a disputed vote. Our next report gets more details.
The West African nation of Sierra Leone is considered one of the poorest in the world. Its 8 million population is still healing from the ravages of an 11-year-old civil war that ended more than 2 decades ago. The impoverished nation was thrown into turmoil early Sunday morning when assailants sent gunfire ringing across the usually peaceful capital, Freetown. The early morning attack took both residents and security forces by surprise. Fears of a possible coup in the troubled region were raised. as gunmen tried to break into the key armory of the country's largest military barracks, located near the presidential villa. Engaging the security forces in a 2-hour raid, the assailants targeted major detention centers as well, including the central prison, which holds more than 2,000 inmates. Some 1,890 inmates are believed to have escaped from the Pademba Road Central Prison after the assailants broke in. 23 of those prisoners have been nabbed and brought back. Pinning the blame on renegade soldiers, the government said the attack had been repelled.
In the early hours of this morning, there was a breach of security at the military barracks at Wilberforce in Freetown. Some individuals attacked the military armory and other locations in Freetown, including Pademba Road Correctional Center. In the event, prisoners escaped. The attackers have been repelled by a combined team of gallant security forces, and calm has been restored.
Among the 19 who died included 13 soldiers, 3 assailants, a police officer, a civilian, and a person working in private security. Soon after the armory came under attack, an immediate national curfew was imposed and public were asked to remain at home. 13 military officers and a civilian have been arrested over the attempted coup. A tense calm returned to the streets of Freetown on Monday, though gunshots were fired on Tuesday as well in the Murraytown neighborhood.
The fire will take place.
After the firing that took place yesterday at Koso Town Junction, we came out and saw some bullet shells. These are some of the bullet shells, the empty shells, you can see them. Some of us have never experienced this until yesterday. We are praying for this not to repeat because this country belongs to all of us. If this continues, where are we supposed to go? Because we will not have this kind of peace in another man's country.
The police explained that it was part of the operation to nab perpetrators of Sunday's attack, many of whom were still hiding or on the run across the country. West Africa has witnessed a series of military coups and attempted coups since August 2020. Sierra Leone President Julius Maada Bio, who was first elected to power in 2018, was re-elected in June with 56.17% of the vote, barely over the 55% needed to avoid a runoff. The result was rejected by the main opposition, All People's Congress Party. Inconsistencies and lack of transparency in counting were condemned by international observers as well, including the United States and the European Union. And in August, a number of soldiers were arrested and accused of plotting a coup against the president. The attempted coup on Sunday, though thwarted, has deepened the political tension and cast an ominous shadow over the peace and security in the West African nation.
And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, please feel free to do so on the ID that you're seeing on your screens. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh, and I'll see you again next week.